My husband forgot to disconnect the Bluetooth in his car after our brief lunch check-in. Through the crisp speaker of my phone instead of the dial tone, I heard the rustle of a jacket, the clink of a glass, and then his voice, devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for me. The marriage is a sinking ship, Marcus, but I'm staying on board until her father's commercial portfolio opens up to me. I didn't drop my phone, I didn't cry out, my lungs simply refused to expand. I sat perfectly still at my mahogany desk, staring at the panoramic window of my office as if the Boston skyline could explain the man I had slept next to for 4 years. Julian's voice cut through the silence again, sharp and entirely calculated. Her old man practically owns half the historic district. You think I'm putting up with her rigid routines for love? There's a massive trust restructuring happening in 24 months. Once my name is pinned to those downtown developments, I'm out. She won't see a thing coming, she's too safe. The call finally cut black, my hand didn't tremble, that physical collapse would find me much later. In that exact second, the smartphone in my palm felt like a cold piece of iron delivering a quiet verdict. 4 years of shared mornings, late-night compromises, and carefully mended arguments unraveled in less than 60 seconds. It had all been a rehearsed performance, a calculated transaction disguised as devotion. The blueprint of a lie. I walked over to the filing cabinet in the corner of my office and pulled out our engagement album. There was a photo we took on a rocky beach in Maine, wind-whipped, laughing, drenched from a sudden wave. I used to look at that picture and see pure, unfiltered joy. Now looking closer, I noticed his eyes weren't on me, they were directed slightly past my shoulder, aiming at whatever asset was coming next. He had charmed my family effortlessly. My father, a notoriously guarded real estate developer, had taken a year to trust him, eventually calling him a young man with solid foundational instincts. My mother had smiled, telling me I had chosen a partner who anchored me. They had seen a partner. Julian had seen an acquisition. That evening, I didn't sleep a wink. I lay perfectly still in our brownstone apartment, listening to the steady, peaceful rhythm of his breathing beside me. It was terrifying how deeply a person could sleep while holding a passport full of lies. Keeping the script alive, the next morning, the sun broke over the city and I stepped into my armor. I brewed the espresso exactly how he liked it, dark, no sugar, a splash of oat milk. Julian walked into the kitchen wearing his gray cashmere pullover, kissed the side of my neck and murmured, "Morning, beautiful, did you sleep all right?" I forced my lips into a seamless smile. "Perfectly, big day ahead." "Just a few client pitches," he said, leaning against the marble countertop while scrolling through his tablet. For the first time, I actually saw him. I noticed how fluidly his expressions shifted when he glanced at our shared calendar, how smoothly he swiped away a banner notification before turning the screen away from my line of sight. The compliance he was used to from me had blinded him. He assumed I was too comfortable to look. Once the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, the silence rushed back into the room. I didn't break down. Instead, I opened a hidden encrypted document on my laptop. Word for word, I typed out exactly what I had heard on that Bluetooth transmission. I didn't do it for a judge or a legal team, not yet. I did it for myself. I knew that in the agonizing weeks to come, a part of me would try to rationalize his cruelty, try to convince myself that I had misheard, or try to slide back into the warm, familiar fiction of our life. That digital page was my anchor to reality. The architecture of my exit strategy had just begun. That afternoon, I found myself idling my car across the street from my parents' brick estate in Beacon Hill. The engine purred quietly, but I couldn't bring myself to step out. I stared at the grand colonial columns, paralyzed. My father would immediately call his corporate attorneys. My mother would turn the blame inward, wondering what signs she had missed. I couldn't carry the weight of their secondary grief while trying to stabilize my own footing. I turned the ignition back on and went home before Julian returned. By the time his keys jingled in the lock, the apartment smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary. Soft jazz drifted from the speakers, and a single amber candle flickered on the mantel. He stepped inside, shedding his coat with that effortless, cinematic smile. "Smells incredible in here, Elle," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. "I missed you today." "I missed you too," I replied, meeting his gaze without a hint of friction. During dinner, he was vibrant. He detailed a venture capital pitch that had gone exceptionally well, hinting that an angel investor was showing immense interest in his boutique real estate tech platform. I nodded along, offering perfectly timed questions, playing the role of the endlessly supportive wife. I knew exactly what he was angling for. The ultimate goal was always a massive capital buy-in from my father. Later, he poured 2 glasses of Pinot Noir and turned on the sleek linear fireplace. He pulled me against his chest as an indie film played on the screen. I let him hold me, not out of lingering affection, but because I needed to study the layout of our routine. Every touch, every low-toned laugh, every practiced gesture of intimacy, I needed to see it all under a cold, analytical lens if I was going to dismantle it without causing an early explosion. Reading the subtext. By Friday morning, my perception had shifted entirely. The brownstone felt like a stage set. When he wrapped his arms around me from behind, his hands grazing my wrists, my skin prickled with a quiet electric shock of revulsion. I stepped out of his embrace smoothly, heading into the bathroom to stare at my reflection in the mirror. It was astonishing how unchanged I looked on the surface. No one walking past me on the street would guess that less than 72 hours ago, the foundation of my entire adult life had evaporated. I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open, ostensibly checking lease agreements, but my mind was mapping the past 4 years. Was he acting when he tore up during our vows in Nantucket? When he brought up having children and moving closer to the coast, was that just another layer of the trap to bind my family's capital even tighter to his name? I remembered our early days, the tiny, cramped studio in South Boston where we drank cheap Prosecco on the fire escape and counted pennies for takeout. I had believed in his ambition then. I remember telling my sister, Julian is the kind of man who builds things to last. Now, the retroactive clarity was blinding. I recalled how he always insisted on reserving the most exclusive tables whenever my parents were footing the bill. How a heavy, tense silence would wash over him anytime our personal household budgeting came up, yet his eyes would light up whenever my father mentioned a tax-sheltered trust. It wasn't a sudden falling out of love, he had simply never been in it. The encryption of facts. Over the weekend, I began compiling a digital file disguised as a mundane spreadsheet on my phone titled Project Observations. It wasn't standard legal evidence, but it was my psychological armor. Tuesday, 12:15 p.m., thinking of you text sent at the exact minute as Monday's text. Wednesday, 6:30 p.m., brought home a bouquet of white hydrangeas from the boutique grocer, exactly 28 days since the last bouquet. Same casual delivery, saw these and thought of your office. It wasn't spontaneous romance, it was scheduled maintenance. He was running a playbook designed to keep the asset me perfectly compliant and unsuspecting. On Sunday night, I laid a subtle landmine into our conversation. While stirring my tea, I casually murmured, Dad mentioned he's initiating a massive restructuring of the family portfolio next month, reallocating capital, tightening up the governance of the main trusts. He's getting exceptionally private about the numbers. Julian paused, his wine glass hovering inches from his lips. A flash of raw, unfiltered panic flickered across his eyes before his smooth corporate mask slipped back into place. Is everything all right with the firm? He asked, his voice a fraction tighter than usual. Completely, I smiled, taking a slow sip. He just always thinks 10 moves ahead. Julian swallowed, setting his glass down hard. Right, smart man. He didn't touch his wine for the rest of the evening, and later, when I excused myself to bed, I heard the faint, rhythmic creaking of the living R. He didn't touch his wine for the rest of the evening, and later, when I excused myself to bed, I heard the faint, rhythmic creaking of the living room floorboards. He was pacing in the dark. The first hairline cracks in his perfect architecture were beginning to show. By Monday morning, Julian's underlying panic morphed into a suffocating wave of overtentiveness. My phone buzzed every 2 hours with hollow check-ins. What are you up to, Elle? Thinking of you. Let me know if I can swing by and grab you lunch. I replied only when it suited me, keeping my answers sparse, stripped of emojis and warmth. I wasn't acting out of anger, I had simply lost the desire to participate in his theater. At 3:00 p.m., he sent a frantic voice note. You've been incredibly quiet today, Elle, everything good? His voice carried that overly cautious, velvet tone people use when they feel the sand shifting beneath their feet and are desperate to secure their grip. He didn't wait for a response. At 5:30 p.m., he unexpectedly materialized in the lobby of my office building. He stood by the security desk holding a premium espresso and a box of pastries from the French bakery I used to frequent 2 years ago. Thought you could use a late afternoon rescue, he said, offering that familiar dimpled smile. But his eyes were frantic, darting across my face, hunting for clues, trying to read the unreadable. Everything all right? I asked, keeping my posture entirely neutral. Of course, just missed my wife, he murmured, leaning in to press his lips against mine. He didn't aim for the cheek or the forehead. It was a deliberate, lingering kiss right in front of the reception desk. He wanted my colleagues to see it. He needed witnesses to validate the lie he was desperately trying to keep alive. The invisible lines. That night, while he busied himself in the kitchen cooking for the third consecutive evening, clinging to the hope that a candlelit dinner could reset the invisible distance between us, I made my first concrete move. I didn't try to hack his phone or dig through the locked drawers in his office. Instead, I quietly logged into my personal premarital savings account, the one my father had set up for me during my college years, which Julian had never been granted access to. I changed the password, updated the security questions, and routed all digital statements to a brand new, unlinked email address. The next morning, I stepped into a private branch of my bank downtown, completely bypassing our neighborhood location. I sat with a bank manager behind closed glass and initiated the opening of a completely separate checking account under my maiden name, ensuring there was absolutely no digital footprint or paper trail linking back to our shared brownstone. I transferred a conservative sum from my savings, enough to anchor myself for a quiet separation, but small enough to remain entirely unnoticed on any high-level review. When I returned home that weekend, I found a massive, ostentatious floral arrangement waiting on the dining table. White orchids, trailing eucalyptus, and a heavy card written in his elegant cursive script. To the woman who deserves the world, I love our future. My sister happened to be over when they arrived. She looked at the arrangement, then at me, her brow furrowing. Julian is really pushing the romance lately, isn't he? Is everything okay? I stared at the orchids, seeing them for what they truly were, a desperate bribe to buy my silence, a calculated expense report disguised as affection. He's just managing his investments, I murmured quietly. The midweek confession. On Thursday evening, I decided to test the depth of his anxiety. As we sat on the couch reviewing our separate digital workloads, I looked up from my laptop and said casually, I think I'm going to recommend that Dad completely pull out of the waterfront development project. He's looking to downsize his commercial exposure significantly over the next few months. Julian froze, the sleek tracking pad beneath his fingers clicked sharply. He didn't look at me immediately, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten until the bone showed. Downsize, he repeated, his voice dropping an octave. That seems rash. That project is the crown jewel of the quarter. There's immense leverage there for outside partners. He doesn't need leverage anymore, I said smoothly, shutting my laptop. He values privacy over expansion now. Later that night, I woke up to an empty bed. The digital clock read 2:14 a.m. I slipped out of the sheets and walked silently down the carpeted hallway. The door to his home office was cracked open by a mere inch. A sliver of cold blue light from his monitor illuminated the floorboards. I stood in the shadow of the corridor listening. Julian was pacing, his phone pressed tight to his ear, his voice a frantic, harsh whisper. No, Marcus, you don't understand. The old man is tightening the locks. If he pulls the capital before the restructuring, the tech platform is dead in the water. I've spent 4 years building this bridge. I'm not letting her family walk away before I get my cut. I stood there in the dark, breathing in the cold air of the hallway. He hadn't just built a lie, he had built a cage. And he had no idea that I had already found the key. By Friday morning, Julian's composure was entirely fractured. He was spiraling under the radar, but to an eye trained on his patterns, it was unmistakable. I watched him open and close the silver kitchen drawer twice within 5 minutes, staring blankly at the cutlery as if he had entirely forgotten the concept of a spoon. He accidentally spilled coffee grounds across the white quartz counter and didn't wipe them away. He just stood there, staring at the dark mess, before turning on his heel and walking out. I kept my distance, ensuring my energy didn't mirror his frantic rhythm. My voice remained level, my movements deliberate. Do you have a heavy schedule today? I asked lightly as he gathered his briefcase. Just some final adjustments on a pitch, he muttered, shifting his weight. Nothing set in stone yet. Final, it was an interesting choice of vocabulary. After the heavy oak door clicked shut, I went to my dressing room and pulled out my wallet. I took out $200 in cash from my newly established private account. I didn't need the physical bills, but I wanted to see them resting in the leather slot, a tangible piece of proof that my life was fracturing away from his, that there were still parts of me his calculations couldn't touch. The gathering of witnesses. That afternoon, I made the call I had been avoiding for 2 weeks. I asked my parents if I could swing by their estate for an unannounced dinner. Just family, I told my mother. There's a structural matter we need to review. When I arrived at the Beacon Hill house, the tension in the kitchen was palpable. My parents were seated at the long island, a quiet anxiety written across their faces. I took a deep breath, sat across from them, and laid out the facts. I explained the lingering Bluetooth call, the specific timelines Julian had calculated, and his explicit admission that our 4-year marriage was nothing more than an entry ticket to my father's commercial portfolio. I didn't cry. I didn't let my voice waver. I delivered the information with the cold precision of a corporate auditor. My mother pressed a trembling hand against her lips. My father sat back heavily in his leather chair, his face darkening into a fierce, protective silence. How long have you been carrying this alone, Alina? He asked finally. 14 days, I replied, and I have tracked every pattern since. His entire platform is built on the expectation of our family's capital. My father nodded slowly, a dangerous calm settling over his features. What do you want to do? The legal team can freeze his access to the downtown project proposals by Monday morning. Not yet, I said softly. I want him to play his final hand when he thinks he's winning. The last dinner. To test his remaining stamina, I suggested we dine out that Saturday night at the Harborfront Steakhouse he loved, the one where he always insisted on ordering the reserve vintages whenever my father was holding the black card. Julian brightened instantly when I made the suggestion. The prospect of a high-end public appearance seemed to inject life back into his failing script. At the restaurant, he was dazzling. He flirted effortlessly with the sommelier, laughed loudly at his own jokes, and spun an elaborate narrative about a new coastal real estate app he was drafting. Halfway through the main course, while he was in the middle of describing generational wealth, I calmly cut into my salmon and threw out a casual question. Julian, what would happen to your boutique platform if Dad decided to entirely pull out of the commercial market this quarter, if the trust structure changed and there were no outside partnerships allowed? His silver fork paused an inch from his plate, the animated warmth drained from his eyes, replaced instantly by a sharp, calculating glint. Why would you ask something like that? He asked, his voice dropping its melodic tone. Just curiosity, I smiled, meeting his gaze directly. Markets shift. I'm wondering how much of your architecture relies on my last name. He forced a stiff, hollow laugh and reached across the white tablecloth to grasp my fingers. Elena, it wouldn't change a thing. Yes, certain avenues would require a different layout, but that's not why I'm at this table. I'm here because I love you. I let his hand rest on top of mine, but I didn't squeeze back. His skin felt completely cold. He thought he had successfully re-anchored the lie, but as we walked out into the chilly Boston air, I knew the illusion was dead. The final act was ready to begin. By Sunday evening, the finality of the decision had completely taken root. There was no grand emotional crescendo, no dramatic shattering of glasses or screaming into a mirror, just a heavy, frozen clarity. The performance was over. Julian spent the afternoon in the kitchen marinating chicken and preparing an intricate meal, acting out a glossy, domestic version of himself. He lit the fine taper candles and pulled out the expensive crystal wine glasses we usually reserved for family celebrations. You look stunning, Elle, he murmured as I came downstairs. Thank you, I said evenly, sitting at the immaculately set table. He served the dinner with a theatrical flourish, raising his glass to new beginnings. I lifted mine but didn't take a sip. We traded hollow pleasantries about the neighborhood, a friend's new startup, and the erratic New England weather. I let him spin the fiction for a few minutes longer, watching the absolute confidence in his eyes. Then, as he stood up to clear our plates, I spoke into the quiet room. I want to talk about the Bluetooth call from 2 weeks ago. Julian froze, his back completely to me, his fingers gripping the edge of the porcelain plate with white-knuckled intensity. What call? He asked, turning around slowly, his face blanked into a forced, neutral expression. The one you forgot to disconnect in your car, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like ice. I heard everything, Julian, every single word. The rehearsed defense. His mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut as he scrambled for a recovery script. Elena, listen to me, it's not what you think. You told Marcus our marriage was a sinking ship, I stated factually. I was venting, he said, stepping toward the table, his hands gesturing frantically. I was having an incredibly stressful day at the firm. You know how guys talk when they're blowing off steam. You said you were only staying with me until my father's commercial portfolio opened up to you. I continued, unmoving. I was being reckless and stupid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the door as if looking for an exit. I didn't mean it, it was a terrible, thoughtless joke. You said I was too safe, that I wouldn't see it coming. A suffocating silence stretched between us. Julian slowly sank into the chair opposite me, leaning forward, trying to project a desperate sincerity. Look, Elle, I've made massive mistakes. I got comfortable with the leverage your family's name provides. Maybe I've leaned into that advantage too hard, but that doesn't mean my feelings for you are a lie. Doesn't it? No, he said fiercely. I married you because I love you. Everything else, the real estate, the trusts, that's just circumstantial business. Dismantling the timeline. I leaned back, studying the contours of his face. When we first started dating, Julian, how long did it take you to ask about my father's firm? He blinked, thrown off balance. What? I don't even remember. That's a normal thing to discuss. It was our second date, I said calmly. Over coffee. The moment I explained the scope of the downtown portfolio, your entire demeanor changed. And by our third date, you casually referenced a private industry article about my father's asset management, an article you could only find if you were explicitly digging into his background. His face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. I was interested in your life, that's what people do when they care about someone. He stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the dining room. You're twisting the past, Elena. You're taking standard relationship dynamics and making them sound like a corporate heist. Is it standard to use a joint household card to fund an unlisted consulting service for the past 6 months? Julian went entirely rigid, the smooth talking stopped. I don't know how to convince you, he muttered, suddenly looking incredibly small under the dim dining room lights. You can't, I said softly, standing up from the table, because I already heard the truth when you thought the audience was gone. I think you need to pack a bag and leave the brownstone tonight. He looked at me across the flickering candles, the gourmet dinner completely cold between us. I never meant for you to get hurt, he whispered. I know, I replied, walking toward the stairs. You only meant for me to find out when it was too late. He left the next morning. He didn't carry a suitcase, just a leather backpack and his laptop, claiming it was a temporary arrangement to give me space. I didn't say a word as he stood in the doorway, still waiting for a script that would let him back inside. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, I turned the deadbolt with a quiet, decisive click. The voicemail and text barrages began by Tuesday afternoon. I'm sorry, I still love you, we can fix this. Then came a handwritten 4-page letter left in the mailbox, a curated masterpiece of emotional framing. He wrote about his professional insecurities, his failures, and how intimidated he had been by my family's shadow. He barely touched upon the money, framing it as an accidental crutch rather than a calculated target. I didn't reply to a single syllable. I simply forwarded every message, letter, and call log directly to my corporate attorney. The financial autopsy. The legal unraveling was quiet, forensic, and absolute. My father's legal team launched a deep audit of our joint accounts and asset history. What we uncovered wasn't a sudden mistake. It was a slow, systematic bleeding of funds. Over the past 8 months, Julian had initiated irregular, unmapped withdrawals. He had routed thousands of dollars under the guise of tech consultation fees to a shell company that didn't exist on any state registry. Even more telling, a secondary paper trail revealed routine personal transfers to an account linked to a name from his college past, maintenance payments disguised as business overhead. When faced with the binder of financial documentation during our formal mediation 2 weeks later, Julian's smooth talking evaporated entirely. His high-priced attorney looked increasingly trapped by the sheer volume of the paper trail. I never intended for the legalities to get this hostile, Elena, Julian muttered across the mahogany conference table. You intended for the deception to go far enough, I replied flatly. He didn't speak again. By the end of the month, the dissolution was finalized. He walked away with absolutely nothing tied to the family name, the downtown portfolios, or the historical trusts. I even kept the vintage watch I had gifted him for our first anniversary. The architecture of his 4-year plan had collapsed into dust under the weight of his own recorded voice. Epilogue: the new blueprint. Julian, he relocated to Chicago within a month of the divorce being finalized. On professional networks, he swiftly rebranded himself as a resilient tech founder and corporate strategist, pairing his polished headshots with manufactured captions about overcoming unforeseen setbacks and building personal growth. He still curates a fiction for an invisible audience, forever hunting for validation in a language he borrows from better men. The family, my parents remain exactly who they have always been: steadfast, grounded, and intensely protective from a respectful distance. My father never once uttered the words "I told you so." He simply helped me lock down the corporate perimeter and gave me a silent, proud nod when the final corporate decrees were signed. Elena, I moved out of the brownstone into a sun-drenched loft overlooking the Charles River. It is smaller, entirely mine, and beautifully quiet. I no longer monitor my vocabulary to keep a fragile ego comfortable, nor do I look at a calendar to see if my affection matches a scheduled timeline. A few weeks ago, I found the digital folder labeled Project Observations. I didn't look through the pages with anger. I simply dragged the file into the trash and emptied it. The proof had served its purpose. The real victory wasn't exposed in a courtroom. It was reclaimed in the silence of my own home, brewing my own coffee, knowing that my life belongs completely to me.